Welcome to the Hidden Composers podcast, where we discuss people we may know from history books, but unbeknownst to us, they compose music. Hi, I'm Brenna Green.
And I'm Cameron Meckling.
Today, our hidden composer will be the poet Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound proved to be inextricable from modernist poetry. Some consider him to be the central figure in early 20th century poetic movements. He was one of the earliest proponents of the Imagist and Vorticism movements. He began many groups and abandoned them with the same frequency. His musical career tied into both artistic movements, which we will discuss later. Ezra Pound was innovative in that he paved the way for other poets to follow, such as Gertrude Stein and James Joyce, among others. He was avid in promoting other poets' careers as well. James Joyce wrote to another poet, William Butler Yeats, "I can never thank you enough for having brought me into relation with your friend Ezra Pound, who is indeed a miracle worker." Ernest Hemingway, a fellow poet and compatriot of Ezra Pound, wrote that Ezra was the most generous writer I have ever known, and the most disinterested. He helped poets, painters, sculptors, and prose writers that he believed in, and he would help anyone whether he believed in them or not if they were in trouble. Pound's life forces us to consider the role of the poet in the world, and the extent to which poets may be considered political figures. Certainly, his own political involvement didn't turn out well for him, but we will get into his choices in a bit. Let's trace the beginnings of Ezra Pound's life all the way back to a small town in Idaho. In 1885, Ezra Loomis Pound was born in Haley, Idaho. In his article, How I Began, Pound reflected back on his youth and claimed that he had resolved to know more about poetry than any man living by the age of 30. To work towards this goal and amass a knowledge of a slew of cultures, he lived in many places during his life: Philadelphia, Madrid, London, Venice, New York, and Paris, among others. In 1908, he moved back to England to bask in the glow of who he thought was the greatest living poet, William Butler Yeats. There, Pound situated himself in the London literary avant-garde circles. Make it new, that was the slogan of Ezra Pound. In poetry, he disliked the flabby yet decadent, dull, repetitive work of England of the day. He wanted to pare everything down. He valued above all precision, clear imagery of words, and everything that was spare and hard and dry. His sense of brevity was influenced by haiku traditions of Japan, which he studied. He was influenced by No theater as well, incorporating the austere style and distinctive character into his works. One of the artistic movements that Ezra Pound embraced in his poetry was Imagism. The basic tenets of this movement included an emphasis on clarity, directness, and a lack of unnecessary words. In poetry, Imagism functions like a successive series of vignettes to create a larger picture. Ezra Pound laid down 3 Imagist rules in the 1913 issue of Poetry magazine, namely, 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. Pound later expanded on these rules by publishing an Imagist manifesto, structured on what to do and what not to do for those who wanted to write in the Imagist style. He titled this A Few Don'ts. Here's an extract from it. An image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. I use the term complex rather in the technical sense employed by the newer psychologists, though we may not agree absolutely in our application. It is the presentation of such a complex instantaneously which gives that sense of sudden liberation, that sense of freedom from time limits and space limits, that sense of sudden growth which we experience in the presence of the greatest works of art. It is better to present one image in a lifetime than to produce voluminous works. All this, however, some may consider open to debate. The immediate necessity is to tabulate a list of don'ts for those beginning to write verses. I cannot put all of them into mosaic negative. To begin with, consider the 3 propositions demanding direct treatment, economy of words, and the sequence of the musical phrase, not as dogma. Never consider anything as dogma, but as the result of long contemplation, which, even if it is someone else's contemplation, may be worth consideration. Here is In a Station of the Metro, written by Ezra Pound in 1913. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now, if we contrast that with another of Pound's poetic works, the difference is almost comical in regards to size. His lifelong work was the Cantos, a huge collection of poems that he worked on and off for over 50 years. Some consider it to be the most complex and challenging collection of poems of the 20th century. Clocking in at 800 pages, it attempted to be a cursory collage of all the poetic traditions in the world, which is simply crazy. While Pound described it as an epic including history, the Times, when it published Pound's obituary later on, called it a great improvisation rather than a poem. Pound unexpectedly broke from the Imagist movement and went on to start another movement with his friend, fellow poet and artist, Wyndham Lewis. They called it Vorticism, and it suffered a short-lived fate. However, in Pound's 1913 essay on Vorticism, he quotes the 19th century English literary critic Walter Pater. He says, "All arts should approach the conditions of music." Let's take a look at an interesting musical collaboration of Ezra Pound's, his relationship with the composer George Antheil. In 1923, a meeting between the two was orchestrated by a mutual friend at her house, and she was certain that such larger-than-life personalities would get on well together. There, for the first time, I met the composer, Eric Satie, and a Mephistophelian red-bearded gent who turned out to be Ezra Pound. Margaret Anderson had given Ezra quite a spiel about me. According to her, I was a genius, and Ezra was vastly intrigued by all this, for as everyone knows, Ezra was at that time the world's foremost expert in genius. In fact, he frankly called himself an expert in genius. He was unusually kind and gracious to me, and as I left, he asked for my address and said he would someday come round to see me. Ezra turned up early the next morning, in a green coat with blue square buttons, and his red pointed goatee and kinky red hair flew off from his face in all directions. Ezra asked me to get some of my music and go with him to the home of a friend who had a piano. I did so, went with him, played for hours, and Ezra seemed very pleased with it all. He He accompanied me back home and asked if by any chance I had written anything about my musical aims. And I said, yes, I have, which accidentally happened to be the truth. Ezra was most delighted with all of this and asked if he could keep the precious sheets for a while. He would take scrupulous care of them. After Ezra's visit, and as the weeks went by, it became more and more apparent that Ezra was working with the stuff I had written. Sylvia Beach, who always got to know everything first, told me that Ezra was planning to write a book about me, and that a friend of Ezra's, Bill Bird, would publish it in Paris. This scared me. 1924 was an eventful music year for Pound. He wrote several essays on music, one specifically about the composer and his friend, George Antheil. He wrote, Stravinsky's merit lies very largely in taking hard bits of rhythm and noting them with great care. Antheil continues this. He is supremely sensitive to the existence of music in time-space. Another of Pound's musical treatises figured on a discussion of harmony, where he concentrates on the element of time combined with harmony, which makes sense since he was a poet and had a natural concern and feeling for rhythm. I found it surprisingly entertaining to read, filled with quips about certain unquestioned traditions of music theory. I want to read to you a paragraph from it about melody as it relates to harmony. When harmony was alive, it was merely a personal giveaway. It was a bundle of tricks of the trade, the fruit of personal experience. It was a way of getting over a difficulty or managing a turn of expression. It wasn't intended to cramp anyone's style. It was pragmatic. It worked, and each school worked its trade secrets to death with the magnificence of bel canto, of music up to Johann Sebastian. The mechanism was a plus thing. It worked in an open field. The mess came when it was set up as a fence, and everyone tried to walk on the rails or climb over it. They rotted their melodies by trying to find schemes which harmonize according to a concept of harmony, in which the tendency to lifelessness was inherent. Most of Ezra Pound's music is predominantly monophonic with sparse harmonies. He seems to have intertwined his dislike of over-describing ideas in his poetry with his repugnance of a dependence on harmony to carry a musical work. Much like his poetic ideals, Pound believed that music should not be sentimental and that melody alone should not be relied upon. Pound writes in his Treatise of Harmony, the element most grossly omitted from other treatises on harmony up to the present is the element of time. The question of the time interval that must elapse between one sound and another if the two sounds are to produce a pleasing consonance or an interesting relation has been avoided. Just as Pound was a proponent of fellow modernist poets, he ventured out into promoting a revival of a composer fallen out of favor in general esteem, at a time when Antonio Vivaldi's music was considered trite and nothing of importance. Pound and violinist Olga Rudge, who also happened to be his mistress, together spearheaded the revival of Vivaldi's music as a notable body of composition. Unfortunately, Pound's somewhat benevolent role as a promoter of both modernist poets and unappreciated composers of the past has been largely overshadowed by the consequences of his political choices. As a vehement anti-Semite who actively supported the fascists during World War II, Pound was indicted for treason following the war and imprisoned in Pisa, Italy. He was declared legally insane in 1945 and was held in the infamous St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Following his release in 1958 until his death in 1972, Pound adopted a sort of select mutism later in life, preferring his own company at his home in Murano, Italy, and devoting the rest of his days to working on his lifelong poem, the Cantos. We're going to take a short break to talk to you about some important announcements, and after that, we'll take a closer look at some of Ezra Pound's own music.
Hey everyone. I just wanted to take this time to shamelessly plug our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram accounts, where we will announce our new episode topics as we get the ball rolling here at Hidden Composers. You can find a listen-along playlist on our YouTube channel, where we have a collection of songs dedicated to each composer we talk about. You can also help support us through donations on our Patreon page, where you can access full interviews with our wonderful guests and even request hidden composers for future episodes. Don't forget to subscribe on your podcast app. Your ratings and reviews help our podcast grow. When you first take a listen to Ezra Pound's music, you may notice that it sounds quite foreign in its style, form, and texture. In a lot of ways, it is oddly thin orchestrally, and rhythms are often quite irregular, jolting, swinging, and racing about almost humorously at times. Despite its oddity, there is something intrinsically musical, intelligent, and even ancient in the sounds of Pound's music. If we take a look particularly at his vocal music, the text Pound presents to us never deviates from the absolute center of the work. Just as Wagner took one step further with his drama through the idea of total work of art, Pound took his poetry another step further through the vehicle of music. His opera's most immediately apparent modernist characteristic is its frequently complex melodic line, a complexity that forms the response of musical to textural rhythm. Pound's modern music looks back to the French troubadours. For those who are unfamiliar, troubadours were French medieval lyric poets in the 11th through 13th centuries. They would write verse and set it to music. In this setting, the strict medieval prosody enslaves melody to verse, and all good lyrical works of the Middle Ages are judged in how these two arts combined and react upon each other. This is done through the use of 6 basic rhythmic modes, which determine the rhythms used in a particular song. These rhythmic modes constitute carefully defined and controlled sequences of regular rhythmic pulses, which are more or less suited to different poetic forms. Although a lot of his writing decisions were informed by interpretation of medieval song, Pound disrupts the traditional musical expectations through the opera's most immediately apparent modernist characteristic, which is its frequently complex melodic line, a complexity that is derived from the response of musical to textural rhythm. The opera's texture and harmonic language is quite unique as well. Much of the opera's pointillistic orchestration devoids any sense of traditional harmonic practice. The instrumentation itself is often sparse, percussion instruments predominant, while others, most insistently violin, cello, oboe, play only limited roles, often supporting the vocal line in unison, although this is not sustained by one instrument throughout. When the strings vary from this echo of the vocal line, they sometimes produce sustained passages centered on one pitch. These pedal points tend to reinforce rhythmic patterns, and only as a secondary consideration do they color the changing parts around them. But they do often punctuate vocal rhythms and establish their own counter-rhythmic effects. In regard to the form of the piece, Pound rejected the option of strophic setting. The songs are through composed so that Each stanza receives its own particular melodic representation. However, Pound does reconstitute previous material, allowing a tiny bit of repetition, but it's always about the text for Pound. A lot of folks did not receive his music well due to the lack of understanding and context that went into creating it. Here's a section regarding a more recent reception of Pound's opera from an article by Larry Lyle. On November 13th, 1971, Le Testament was performed at Berkeley by Western Opera Theatre. Critical response was largely negative, praising the production, but failing to appreciate the opera. In a letter from Hughes to Schaffer, Hughes remarks that the opera was judged by, quote, our stereotype music critics, who tend to place Le Testament in the standard operatic tradition from Rossini to Strauss, and made no attempt to judge Pound on his own ground or in the context of what he set out to do. I am convinced that neither the work nor the production was the source of the critics' lack of perception. They were simply unprepared and out of context. I was not alone among those who worked on the opera over many months of preparation, in finding that the work grew in strength with familiarity, and not the opposite. The substance is there, end quote. In a later letter, he was more direct, saying, quote, the narrow and bone-headed music critics simply weren't prepared and didn't know what they were listening to or for. However, the opera will be vindicated by the recording, and it's the long run that counts, end quote. It's a work of curious beauty and perception, as Antheil stated in his 1923 foreword to the score. There is really nothing more to say. Those who want to understand will understand Villon. William Walter Hoffa expounds on the musical collaboration of Ezra Pound and George Antheil through the lens of the Vorticism movement, as follows. It is also true that T.S. Eliot's success was secure by 1923, and Pound was probably looking elsewhere for someone in need of his polemic skills. Antheil's experiments he saw, moreover, as a parallel to those he had himself been urging in poetry, a reaction against the listless impressionism of the post-romantic rhetoric. In musical terms, this meant a rejection of both Wagner, a great musician in his manner of greatness, produced a sort of pea soup. Debussy distilled it into a heavy mist, which the post-Debussians have desiccated into a diaphanous dust cloud. Another shared fascination that drew Pound and Antheil in simpatico is rhythm, complex, exact rhythm. Or more precisely put, the way in which time evolves an event. Going back to the aesthetic movements of Imagism and Vorticism, in 1917, Pound determined that the most salient facet of poetry was the image. It was only the moving image which, to him, could capture the pulse of life. Thus, the element of time must enter poetry if the long, major philosophical poem was to be written. In Pound's head, the Imagist poems had their parallel in the over-refined impressionism of the piano works of Debussy. Vorticism, according to Pound, was a correlated aesthetic which carries you through all arts. The salient facet of music was rhythm, not the evocation and representation of literary mood. Thus, the new music he sought had to be rhythmically based and had to have edge and precision. There's a lot to unfold when it comes to the artistic pursuits of Pound. Looking back, it becomes clear that this energetic entrepreneur of the arts did more than any other single figure to advance the modern movement in English and American literature. Through writing poetry and through writing music, the text seems to rise on top in Ezra Pound's works, proving as the number one focus each time, through and through. This concludes this episode of Hidden Composers. I want to thank again Jacob Zering, our audio engineer, for all of his help.
We'll see you all next time with a brand new episode where we will be talking about the last queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani. Thanks for listening.